things happen. We don't want things to happen. All right. So we're good to go, huh?
We're good to go.
All right. Let's see, make sure our pointer is working, and it is. Terrific. All right, Edgar, thanks a lot.
All right.
And then you'll come back and. So I'm going to go till about 10 after, just so you know that.
Okay. So can you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Because I got a meeting soon at 3. When you're done with the talk, can you click here, finish?
Finish. Okay. And that's all I need to do.
That's all you need to do.
And then you'll come and get the thing.
Because once that's done, it's recorded and it won't be lost.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Joe, what's happening? I'm coming down. Yeah, I'm going to stand up here. I decided I don't want to get very much about the shoes on and a cane and a top hat.
That's what he said. Yeah. I mean, and the weird thing, I was talking to Lee, I was looking at her averages are, her average last year was like 80, and this year's 80. Or maybe it's 82. Oh, wow. Yeah, about what?
He's not going to plans on the 25th or something. I don't know if it's situation. I said, well, I'm leaving at 18. So I'm just trying to find someone to swap with. I said, well, this is still one, right? Yeah. Because I said, I can't get very healthy like he's been not going to be here.
So, yeah.
Yeah. It's his problem. Yeah.
Yeah, it's late in the game.
Well, that's what he said. He said, so we should check with him before we leave.
So you see,
I mean, these plans.
exactly. And you can give it that way without
Well,
away before anyone else.
well, yeah, we all had it surgery. That wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
Anyways, I just thought I'd bring it up to me today.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not going to do that. I'm not even doing that.
Yeah.
It's the week after I get back.
Maybe you want to stay for next week.
Yeah. All right.
See ya. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I think it's close enough till 22, I won't get yelled at. So you can plan on as per the calendar, since it's been revised. I will go till 10 after 3 because these lectures were designed for 4 times 1.5 hours. And then last year when they decided to cut a lecture short, I said, well, I'm not going to, so that shouldn't be a problem because your next class isn't until what, like 3:30 or 3:20 or something. This is the only one today. But when you have the following classes at 3:20. Between 5 and 10 after. Okay. We'll get it done. So the more time I spend talking about this kind of thing, the less time I'll have. Okay, so I'm Dr. Zach, in case you're not remembering. I understand there's a big exam tomorrow, and that's why no one's here. See, before I taught cardio in this course, I would come in, this would be my first lecture, and no one would show up. And I was like, what the hell, man? I got really insulted. Now I realize it's because it's a test, so I don't care anymore. Anyways, hopefully the podcast will capture, because otherwise some people are really going to be out of luck. Missing 25% of the renal material. If you need an outside reference, Vander's is a good one. You're not going to find anything in there that's not in my ebook. So for those of you who didn't quite get it in cardio, you better read my ebook, at least skim through it. Again, like cardio, there's all kinds of supplementary practice material posted with today's session. I think the practice exam is posted with the last day's session. So take advantage of that or not, but that's up to you. And you know where I live. Okay, clinical applicability, same story, okay? So you're used to me, we've done the talk the talk and walk the walk, and we're going to do more of the same. There's going to be a lot of familiar terminology, a lot of familiar concepts, like what I talked about in cardio. I said we're going to keep talking about blood pressure and venous return and body fluid status and all that, all right? Diabetes, we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get well into this, very important in the context of kidney disease. Heart disease, you know, we've already made that case and we'll talk more about it. But obviously, we'll talk about kidney disease per se. Hypertension, again, is going to be one of the focuses of this section, like it was the last one. Okay, and we're going to understand, we're going to finish shoring up those links. If you didn't quite get it in cardio, now's the time we're going to put that all together. Pulmonary disease, well, really, this is going to come into the context of acid base, which we'll talk just a little bit about. Okay, not too much in this course. That's for the spring course, elective, if you can take that. Medications, again, you have a drug list, and we're going to learn about some diuretics. We're going to learn about some other things that are very important in the context of kidney disease. We're going to talk about some old friends, like beta blockers and ACE inhibitors and ARBs and all that kind of stuff, okay? Dehydration is part of the story. Kidneys come into that story nicely. We'll talk about that. Any condition of volume loss, okay? So these two link together. We're going to look at some cases where we see changes in things like electrolytes and what the kidneys are going to try to do to help us compensate for that. All right? Bone mineral density. We're not going to talk about calcium handling in the kidney. It's really important. You'll get I think the last lecture in this course is about calcium and bone. All right? In medical school, I have a lot more time to talk about this, and we spend hours and hours talking about the importance of the kidneys in bone health and maintenance. Okay? So we'll mention it and pass it. The idea of dietary concerns, people are on high or low salt diets, and kind of the link with that with blood pressure and other things. And then the idea of our filling status, and we're going to jump right into that in a second. How much fluid do we have in us, and have we consumed a lot of volume? Have we not consumed any volume? Have we lost too much volume? All of these things are really, really important in the discipline of nephrology. And then there's a whole bunch of links to other endocrine components, and we'll start talking a lot about aldosterone, and then Dr. Fondell will continue that later on. And, it's one of the main kind of endocrine links with the kidney, but then there's a lot of other stuff that comes into play that, we really won't mention a lot of that in this course due to time, but just keep it in mind that this kidney thing, which, again, is oftentimes taught using a lot of equations and numbers and calculations, this renal thing, the idea of renal medicine, okay, is really integrated with very important links across the discipline of clinical medicine, a lot of application everywhere. All right, I'm not going to read through all this stuff, but I like to put this slide up here just for kind of shock value. If you take time to look at this, some of these numbers, okay, are pretty staggering in terms of the amount of people who have this thing called end-stage renal disease. Millions and millions and millions and millions. Numbers are increasing due to a lot of reasons, notably obesity and an aging population, costs in the billions for treating these diseases. A couple things I have in blue here, diabetes and hypertension are the big two. When we talk about kind of unfavorable outcomes in patients with kidney disease, those are the pathologies that lead to renal failure, number 1 and number 2 in order, diabetes and hypertension. So think about that. And then we'll talk about this thing called the glomerulus and glomerular disease, not so much in this course, but really we're going to find out that that's kind of the starting point when we start to talk about renal physiology, or these little things called glomeruli. All right, and so I mentioned the buzzwords, and so obviously then this whole idea of renal physiology, kidney physiology is very, very important in terms of human health and well-being. So I'm just paraphrase that slide. Okay, here's an example of an exam question that you'll never see from me. But anyways, the idea is, kind of tongue-in-cheek. All of the above are regulated or affected by renal function, or the renal system. And, it's a very long list, and this isn't all-inclusive. The things in red, with the exception of bone metabolism, are the things we're going to talk about in this section of this course. But the answer to this silly question is all of the above. As you can see, the tentacles of the kidney are very far-reaching, far beyond making urine. All right? That's kind of the end of a lot of very important control mechanisms. All right, so how then, let's start to build this down into some more specifics. Are the kidneys involved in health and disease? Well, when we talk about the kidney itself and the idea of kidney failure, we're going to talk about, as I said, glomerular function. The structure is called the nephrons, which are these microscopic tubule networks in the kidneys, which facilitate exchange and whatnot of ions and water. We'll spend a lot of time on that for good, obvious reasons. Renal blood pressure is very, very important in telling the kidneys what the heck's going on. Remember, there are baroreceptors located in the kidney. And then the metabolic consequences if the kidneys themselves fail, and they're widespread, numerous. Okay? Regulation of plasma, water, ions, proteins, and pH. And you should start asking yourself, well, why are these things important? Kind of that forest for the trees thing. Disruptions in volume status or electrolytes or acid base, well, these have, again, trickle-down effects to other systems. If a person's underfilled, we've talked about the cardiovascular ramifications of that. If a person has an acid-base disorder, and although you haven't had virtually any of that, these things, if they get out of control, will kill people, And same thing with electrolyte disorders. Why do we need sodium concentrations and potassium concentrations to be maintained within these relatively normal ranges? And you should kind of have a sense of why that is now that you're this far into the course. Adrenal function, specifically adrenal cortex function, and this is where we go back to a familiar friend, the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Very widespread effects in terms of body fluid balance, acid-base, electrolytes, etc. Okay? And again, we're going to look at all of this stuff in detail. Cardiovascular function, I should have put this at the top because when you start to look at the data of patients that have heart failure or heart disease, and the correlation of that with kidney disease, the numbers are staggering. And if you look at it the other way around, patients with kidney disease, especially chronic kidney disease, exorbitant numbers of those patients end up with heart disease and heart failure. So it's not a coincidence, right? There's a very strong link, physiologically and pathophysiologically. And then endocrine function and metabolism, and this could be a very daunting list in terms of diabetes and glucoregulation. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that in the second or third lecture. Calcium, phosphate, and bone, again, not for me, but very, very important. People with kidney disease have problems with bone mineral density and calcium and phosphate regulation, and that wreaks havoc with all kinds of other things. All right, and the neuroendocrine system, and again, an old friend we'll spend some time talking about later on is arginine, vasopressin, ABP. Okay. All right, so again, some introduction. All right, so here's the case, like we did last time, a very meaty case with a lot of words. Now, when you take some time to read through this, there's really nothing in here. There's no vocabulary that shouldn't be familiar. So this is basically a woman, and she's got some signs and symptoms, postural lightheadedness, which means when she stands up, she gets dizzy. She's just generally tired. And we've got some background information about her diet and lifestyle. She denies that she's had any fluid loss. She's denying illicit drug use, and I'm just skimming through this. You should read this over on your own. And then we have some vitals, and you should understand the ramifications of this. This is the type of thing we talked about several weeks ago. All right, and again, we're going to come back to this at the very end. That's why I want you to look at it when you're studying and start to recognize some things. Well, here we go. She's got an ECG with sinus tach. Her skin turgor is dry, mucous membrane, so that means, it's ramifications that she's dehydrated or she doesn't have enough fluid volume for some reason. And then here's where we're going in this section. We're going to start to look at a lot more blood and urine chemistries, labs, and start to make some comparisons of things like the electrolytes, acid-base regulation, and then two markers of kidney function per se being this thing called blood urea nitrogen and creatinine. We'll talk a lot about creatinine maybe today, if not next time for sure. And then urine chemistries. Well, lo and behold, we look at sodium, potassium, osmolality, pH, all familiar terms. terms. All right, we make these comparisons, and at the end of the day, not today, but the end of the last day, we'll be able to understand why these comparisons are very, very important and what they mean. So your task for tonight, well, not tonight, but after tomorrow's exam, take a quick read through this and go, oh, yeah, I get the idea of the cardiovascular findings. I get the idea of the vitals, and just kind of get refreshed with some of that stuff, and we'll come back to it. All right, so let's bring on stage some of the cast of characters for what we're going to be doing for the next several hours. Obviously, the kidneys and the adrenal glands, specifically the adrenal cortex. Okay, the neuroendocrine system, and we introduced this in cardio, and really to cut to the chase, we're talking about the posterior pituitary and who comes from that. AVP, all right. Obviously, the cardiovascular system, and then the whole cellular vascular network of intracellular volumes and extracellular volumes and intravascular volumes. We're going to be using this terminology and looking at the physiology of all this stuff in a fair amount of detail. All right, so we start with kind of the familiar part and realizing that we have a balance between intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid, and effective circulating volume. Remember that one? Well, we're going to talk about that a lot. And venous return, and the idea of the right atrium sensing volume status, and the carotid and aortic baroreceptors helping with that. Then we have baroreceptor and osmoreceptor input into the hypothalamus. Don't worry about these nuclei. You can disregard the specifics here. The idea is feed forward into this neuroendocrine system will signal AVP release when it's appropriate. We'll talk about when that will happen much later on. Okay. And then I took the kidney out here, but really in place of the graphic, the idea of kind of the overarching system, the overarching physiology. With the kidneys at the center, the neuroendocrine and cardiovascular systems being involved in this balance between elimination, which remember that's what we call diuresis now in the nephrology clinic, and conservation, which is what we call anti-diuresis. Okay, so just all kind of an introduction, a lot of familiar terminology. All right, let's go to Pearl right up front. And this is really important. You need to understand this. Our default mode is conservation. That is, we normally will anti-diurese. We're going to learn that the kidney filters a bunch of stuff and hangs on to 90% of it. We'll kind of figure out why that happens later. All right. When we need to eliminate fluid volume or a little bit more sodium than normal, and that's going to be partially fluid volume for whatever reason, we're overfilled, our blood pressure's too high, whatever, all right, we will shift from anti-diuresis to diuresis. So if we were walking around, unless some signal tells our renal system, our renal adrenal system, to diurese, we are anti-diuresing most of the time. And if we weren't, we would pee out our fluid volume in about a minute and a half and we'd be dead. Okay? Because kidneys filter lots of water every minute, tons of it. It's unbelievable. Just to turn around and hang on to it, unless we need to get rid of some of it. Okay? All right. Let's talk a little bit about body water balance. So you can imagine yourself being a bottle of beverage of your choice, and we can fill that bottle with water, all right, by different mechanisms. Okay, so if this is an organism, obviously direct fluid intake, that's intuitive. The idea of food, there's water in a lot of food, okay? And then metabolically, the oxidation of, this just stands for carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Byproducts of a lot of these reactions is the production of water. So that contributes to the water load, all right? We talk about water loss, and this becomes a little bit less intuitive, okay? Except for, if you're cognizant, you realize, urine output, you probably have a pretty good idea of feces output, defecation, maybe sweat, but maybe not. When I'm up here lecturing, after I'm done lecturing, I sit down and I realize I've been sweating, but I'm not noticing it while I'm up here talking and walking around. I noticed it yesterday when I mowed my lawn. We got 5 minutes of sunshine, so I ran out there, and it was humid and pretty warm, and I was drenched. And I was like, wow, no wonder I'm thirsty. All right? Some people don't realize when they're sweating, and respiratory is a big one. Remember, every time you exhale, what comes out? CO2 and water, and a lot of it. All right, this becomes a problem in the clinic, and you don't need to write this down, but think of people who are on ventilation, and you really have to watch their electrolytes and their water balance, because they lose tons and tons of water, and they don't know because they're knocked out mostly. All right. Don't memorize numbers, but just to give you a sense, we are mostly water. We're about almost 2/3 water, so water is important. And again, don't memorize numbers, but of that 60 or so percent, most of our body water is stored intracellularly, and you just need to kind of keep that aware. That's our reserve. Extracellular is about 1/3 of the total body water. And then, interestingly, I might have mentioned this in cardio, but one of these days I'm going to poll 50 people on the street and say, where is most of our body water stored? Most of them would say, well, probably in blood. Well, that's actually the least of it, okay? Again, most of our fluid volume is intracellular, and that acts as our reservoir. If we need that, we'll use it. It'll move due to osmosis and other things, all right? Okay, so again, don't memorize numbers. This is just to give you kind of a point of reference. Okay, going back to effective circulating volume, we'll go through this kind of quickly because we've already covered this, but I will brush across it. All right, remember, that's really the effective volume, and the reason we call it that is because that's basically the perfusing volume. That's, remember, we call that stress volume in the last part of this course. That's the volume that's enabling sustenance of the blood pressure we need to move oxygen and CO2 around. Okay, the rest of this is all 100% review. I just want to remind you that the effective circulating volume is sensed by the arterial baroreceptors at the carotid sinus, okay, and mostly at the carotid sinus, and then also within the afferent arterioles of the kidney. Now, don't worry, we're going to show this in detail, show some graphics of what an afferent arteriole is. But at this point, just remember that an equally important component of the baroreceptor system resides in the kidneys. And the fact of this independence of ECF from ECV, and that's because of, like, remember, our heart failure patient who was actually volume overfilled but couldn't generate blood pressure, so his effective circulating volume was too low. Okay, yes, question?
So the carotid sinus, the baroreceptors and the carotid sinus and afferent arterioles are high pressure.
No, the afferent arterioles are low pressure baroreceptors. Carotid sinus are high pressure, but they can also help with sensing both ends of the spectrum. There's double redundancy in that. Okay, and this is just the idea of what we talked about. I'm not going to spend anything. This is exactly from cardio, reviewing the idea of effective circulating volume. So go ahead and take a look at that. That's 100% review. That's why I'm not going to go through it in detail. If you have questions about what this concept of an ECV or a stress volume is, you need to come to me, and we'll get it straightened out. But we've already discussed that. Okay, let's have fun. Oh, no. Just relax. Put your pens down for a second. Your stylus is whatever you're doing. Okay, let's match these up. Osmoles, A, B, C, D, E, F. Which is the best choice? You're not getting graded on this. C? She says C. Okay. What about osmolarity? There's a method to it. Come on, you gotta guess. You gotta play with me. Otherwise, this is no fun. F. Still no fun. F, okay? I don't know about that. Anyways, osmolality.
D.
Which one?
D.
D? I don't know about that. Osmosis. That's E.
E.
Okay, we get that right on the exam, but I'm not going to ask that. Osmotic pressure.
A.
Oh, no. Because look at the giveaway in equilibrium. All right. Well, the reason I put this up here is because obviously the similarity in these terms, and I just want to make a point that of all of these, this is the one we're concerned with. All right. We need to understand the process of osmosis, and I'm not teaching you that stuff. You know, that's the beaker with the semi-permeable membrane, the salt on one side, water on the other, whatever. All right. Osmolality is important because this is what we measure in patients, and this gives us an idea of body fluid status. And the units of measure, what osmolality means is solutes per kilogram of body water. Okay, and we're going to talk about calculating that. It's super easy. We're not going to really do it, but we're going to look at the equation in just a second. Okay, so please just be familiar with this as the clinically or applicable term that we're going to be using a lot. Okay, let's talk about osmoles. Okay, and what an effective and an ineffective osmole is. And there's an important thing that a couple of points that need to be made. Okay, sodium is our main effective osmole. So what an effective osmole is it's an amylite, a substance, an ion, for example, a chemical, if you will. This is an ion that will grab onto water. Okay, because in the case of sodium, it's charged. It loves water. Whenever it sees a water, it grabs it, pulls it, and keeps it where it's at. All right. Well, sodium is an effective osmole because it'll stay in the compartment in which it tends to want to live. Okay, for it to be moved to another compartment, that requires some kind of transport mechanism, usually active transport, sometimes secondary active transport. Okay, so it'll preferentially distribute. So we have a gradient of sodium. We talked about this in Reynolds talked about this. Extracellular versus intracellular, same idea with potassium, etc. Right on down the line for all of the ions, all of the electrolytes, all right? Because sodium, for example, stays in a compartment and creates a gradient, it creates a very large osmotic gradient that favors water to be around it extracellularly. Now remember, most of the water is intracellular, but where sodium lives, there's going to be water existing too. So there's a fair amount of water that's living extracellularly, all right? Therefore, any changes, especially large changes in plasma sodium, that will be translated to extracellular sodium will very profoundly or markedly affect where body water is distributed. Okay, so let's kind of back this up and re-explain. So, for example, if a person becomes very, very, very hypernatremic, okay, their sodium concentration in their blood is way too high, water is going to be siphoned out of the intracellular volume to dilute that up because of that osmotic gradient. And that can have very profound effects in terms of cellular function. All right, so that's just one quick example, and we're going to come back to that, but that's the idea of an effective osmole. Okay, it requires transport, otherwise it kind of stays put. On the other hand, something like glucose plays both ends of the spectrum. All right, it actually requires primary or secondary active transport, but within normal physiologic healthy ranges, essentially all of the glucose, the vast majority of it is uptaken by cells to fuel metabolic production of ATP, right, or to be stored. And therefore, it does not create a large osmotic gradient. So glucose in and of itself is kind of sort of an effective osmole, but not a very powerful one because there's just not that much of it around normally in plasma. Okay? Most of it's intracellular. Most of that's stored as glycogen. Okay? However, and this is where glucose can play both ends of the spectrum, if a person has impaired cellular glucose uptake, okay, something like type 2 diabetes mellitus where they're insulin resistant, or type 1 diabetes where they don't have any insulin, and their extracellular or plasma levels of glucose can get very, very, very high, then glucose can turn into a very effective osmole and really goof things up. And we'll look at examples of that later. So just kind of tuck this away for now. All right, we'll come back to this. So far we have an effective osmole, normally a not really effective osmole except with a condition. Okay, then an example of an ineffective osmole, something like urea nitrogen. We measure this as BUN, which stands for blood urea nitrogen. Get used to that acronym, you'll see it a lot. Okay. Urea nitrogen is lipophilic. Okay, you know what that means? That's going to traverse the plasma membrane based on its gradient. So if a person's extracellular urea goes up, it'll equilibrate with intracellular, and therefore it doesn't create really an osmotic gradient under normal circumstances. So this is not an effective osmole for that reason. All right. Therefore, with this in mind, we have equations where we can look at osmolality and notice the top equation, but this one's in blue, so that's more important. The top equation to calculate a total osmolality uses 2 times sodium plus glucose divided by 18. This is a conversion factor to get millimoles equal to milligrams per deciliter, and BUN divided by 2.8. All right. However, when we talk about an effective osmolality, the more important osmolality, that's determined by our same calculation here and our same calculation here. Simply the sum of those two, we get rid of BUN because normally it doesn't contribute. Okay? And again, this is used in the context of body fluid status, and we'll look at some examples of this as we work through. Okay? The normal range, which you'll see, you don't need to memorize it, but we'll use it a lot, is around 285 to 295 milliosmoles per kilogram serum water. All right? That would be a normal osmolality. If a person becomes hypoosmolar, that means they're too diluted out. They have too much water for some reason. If a person becomes hyperosmolar, well, they can have too much sodium or too little water or both. So, and we're going to look at, again, examples of where this becomes pertinent as we work our way through. Just to be complete, there's obviously a urine osmolality. Urine generally, okay, especially with healthy kidneys, kind of marches along with plasma. In other words, osmolality in plasma and urine in a healthy person are really about the same. Okay, it's when we see gross differences that really points towards disease states, and we use those numbers, and we'll look at some of those numbers and figure out some things that are going wrong with people. Okay, so an effective osmole basically stays put in one place unless it's actively moved. Okay, since an osmole holds onto a water, an effective osmole tends to hold water where it lives. So we've got to remember. So for example, again, if a person had a huge shift for some reason in the amount of sodium from extracellular to intracellular, and it doesn't happen, but let's just say that did, water would come along with it, and that would create a problem. If a person loses too much sodium from the extracellular environment because of vomiting or diarrhea or an endocrine disease, that person's not going to be able to effectively hold on to a lot of water. They're going to lose water too. That's what happens to us in severe dehydration. We lose a lot of salt, and water goes with it. Okay, so keep that in mind. Water follows salt. That's one of our paradigms. Okay, your version on AMP might say you might want to remember these, disregard that. I changed it the other day to values which we will be using a lot. Okay, so we're going to see things and look at things over and over again, like the classic electrolytes, glucose, and F stands for fasting, blood urea nitrogen, osmolality, and then other stuff we're going to add on to this list. Urine, these values will vary with intake. Make note that for urine, electrolyte values and osmolalities and things like that, for test purposes, and in a lot of our cases, we put reference standards for urine just so you have a point of something to figure out. In the clinic, it ain't that easy. You'll see what I mean as we get to that stuff. Now, importantly, I love the bottom lines that are actually bottom lines. When you're looking at a patient's body water status, you have to evaluate the total clinical picture, and that includes, obviously, a history, if you can get it, what's happened to you, what's been going on, do you have a history of diseases, are you taking medications, fluid intake, blood levels of ions and things like that, and urine levels. So here's the important thing, these two. You have to compare what's inside, so we measure stuff in blood plasma and serum all the time, right? And then you look at stuff in urine. This is the cup, by the way. Okay. Well, what's in between these two? The kidneys, right? So the balance then between plasma values and urine values of stuff is generally going to be determined by what the kidneys are doing or not doing. So these two pre and post measurements of something like a sodium or a potassium can actually point to something that can be going on in the kidneys themselves. Right? So again, this will all kind of build as we work our way through this material. This is just more of the same, the idea of this thing called a comprehensive metabolic panel. And I'm not going to belabor this, but again, some of the things we routinely look at, and we'll be looking at in this part of the course, are glucose and calcium, proteins, and there's an important reason for this, and that gets to albumin, which we'll talk about later. The classic electrolytes of sodium, potassium, and chloride, although you can put any ion on that list that we have inside of us, which is like 15 or 20 different ones. Acid-base status, and you can look at either a partial pressure of CO2 or bicarbonate or both. And then renal function. So we want to circle that. When we talk about renal function in blood labs, we're talking about looking at creatinine and getting an estimated GFR. We're going to talk about this in just a minute. And BUN, blood urea nitrogen. Okay? So for now, just kind of tuck that away, and this is where it all ends up. So why is it critical to maintain analytes such as sodium, potassium chloride, etc., within a set range? So why do we care about blood potassium? Why do we care about blood sodium? Why do we care about blood calcium? And it's not a trick question. It comes right from the first few lectures. Yes? Yeah, the whole idea of electrogenicity and membrane potential, and that's exactly right. Okay? At this most fundamental level of physiology is the concentration of potassium, extracellular versus intracellular, determines the rest of the membrane potential, and the rest is history, and important history. Okay? All right. How does water fit into this? Well, yes?
Moves along with those.
Yeah, well, what's a concentration mean? A lot of times on exams, people are like, well, I didn't know what that meant, but like, well, you need to know what that means. We talk about concentration, what does that mean? It's not a percentage, really. It's an amount of something per volume. Okay, so obviously the amount of water in us is going to play into the concentration of sodium, potassium, et cetera, et cetera. All right? So that's the idea. All right, this is just a reminder. This is my version of electrogenic function. I'm not going to go through this. Come to medical school here, you'll get all that stuff from me, not Dr. Robbins. All right, kidney gross anatomy in 30 seconds or less. I'm not going to go through any of this stuff, except this is a kidney in cross-section. This red thing here, which is not the scale, is microscopic normally, and this is called the nephron, and this is where we're going to be spending all of our time. I'm not talking about the ureters and the bladder, none of that stuff. Okay, we're talking about the nephron and its importance. And there it is. Again, remember, this is not the scale. Normally, you can't see these. Each kidney, FYI, has about 1 million of these to give you some idea of how small they are. And your kidneys are only about that big. They're tiny. So it's pretty amazing. So there's our big nephron, okay? And the reason I should, this is our cartoon. This is our template of what we're going to be, the way we're going to be looking at the nephron and its associated vasculature. First of all, the proximal nephron is this region over here, all right? And the distal nephron is kind of the rest, all right? And that will become important as we talk about what the nephron does regionally. Let's first look at the vasculature, okay? The renal artery brings systemic blood into the kidneys, okay? And then, and this is a dumbed-down diagram, but it gets the point across, feeds into these things called afferent arterioles. They bring blood into a thing called the glomerulus, which is a modified capillary, which we're going to become oh so familiar with. Blood will leave the glomerulus via another important structure called the efferent arteriole with an E. That leads into the structure called the vasa recta, which runs parallel to this part of the nephron, and eventually dumps out into the renal vein, which returns the blood to systemic circulation. So that's the basic roadmap for blood flow in the with the nephron. Now, the blue arrows are superimposing the nephron or the tubular structures with the vascular structures. So, surrounding the glomerulus is a thing called Bowman's capsule. All right, we'll talk about what happens there in just a minute. From there, forming urine will traverse into this first segment called the proximal tubule. Okay? Then it runs through this thing called the loop of Henle. There's a descending and ascending loop down here that you need to remember that. Then the forming urine flows up into this region called the thick ascending limb, next going into the distal convoluted tubule, and then finally dumping into the collecting ducts or collecting tubules. Histologists will tell you those are two discrete regions. Usually I just call them collecting ducts. That's the end of our journey, okay, if we are forming urine. All right, so that's the basic roadmap. This is just showing the flow of forming or formative urine. So stuff gets filtered from blood, and it simply flows in the direction of the yellow arrows. This is a little bit more detailed view of what this thing really looks like. And the only point I want to make on this slide is the existence of these things called peritubular capillaries. Right? The nephron, the tubules, are surrounded by a gazillion capillaries. Because remember, the kidney needs to reabsorb and secrete stuff. And so these capillaries take care of the sheer volume of that. And as we work our way through what goes on in the nephron, that will become very apparent why this vasculature is so extensive. All right, this is just showing blood flow and urine flow. Okay. What about this thing we call urine? I just wanted to show you urinalysis. Okay, let's all say urine and get it over with. Pee. All right. Let's say that it's okay in here. It's a safe environment. All right. All right. The kind of things we look at. Well, this is from one of our patients. Okay, specific gravity, pH, color, appearance, etc., etc. All right. You know, and again, we'll be looking at some of this, you know, as appropriate in this course to give some idea of like, well, normally there shouldn't be any glucose in urine, and this person didn't have any. Normally there shouldn't be any ketones. Their color is good, it's clear, that's great. The pH is within a normal range. Specific gravity is okay. You know, again, this would go hand in hand with a blood lab. Okay, just to show a few ones. Okay, let's get into it. Now the important, really important next few slides, which define the processes overall of what the kidney does. This slide is an important one to, again, set the stage for what we're going to be looking at in a lot of detail. So remember, systemic blood is coming in the direction of the red arrows into the afferent arteriole. Okay? Then that blood enters the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a modified capillary. So that gives you a lot of information. It loves to filter stuff. Okay? And it's all convoluted and twisted into a knot here because that gives it, what, a huge surface area. Okay? Notice that the glomerulus is, again, kind of cupped in by Bowman's capsule. Okay? And what the glomerulus does for a living, shown in bright blue, is it filters stuff. Okay? The filtrate, and what we call the glomerular filtrate, is the first step in forming urine. Okay? So what exists upon glomerular filtration in Bowman's capsule is forming urine, the glomerular filtrate. Now, in the kidneys, when we say filtration, please listen closely, you are talking about a glomerular and a glomerular-only process. Filtration occurs here and here alone. step number one. The next process that's very important to understand in the kidneys is something called secretion. And notice I have two arrows, and I'll tell you why that is. What secretion means is that after the process of filtration, something is being put into that forming urine from either blood supply out here, or the interstitium, or these cells that make up the wall of the tubule called the peritubular epithelium. So in other words, something is being put into the forming urine after filtration has occurred. And we're going to look at examples of when and where that process occurs as we work our way through this thing. Okay? Number 3, reabsorption. Again, reabsorption is a post-filtration process. Reabsorption occurs all along the nephron, and we'll look at where that happens, at various regions. What that means is something is being taken out of the forming urine and either being left in the interstitium for the kidney to use, and or being put back into circulation and returned to systemic circulation. 2 examples of what is wildly reabsorbed would be like sodium and water. We reabsorb essentially all of it. The kidney keeps some for kidney stuff, puts the rest back into circulation. Glucose is another example. All of it in a healthy person is reabsorbed. The kidney keeps a lot of that glucose to fuel all the pumps and things that we're going to look at later on, and a lot of it's returned to blood for use. Okay? So again, filtration by definition, and I think I have a pearl slide. Yeah, filtration by definition is a glomerular process. Okay? Reabsorption and secretion occur throughout the rest of the nephron, and we'll look at specifics of where those are important. Please get this down. It's not a daunting task. You need to understand this because this is kind of like 2 + 2 leading into being able to do division. You need to understand the 2 + 2 part first. All right, the glomerulus. Let's continue looking at it because it's so important. It's really, like I said, the first step in what we call renal function is what's occurring at the glomerulus. All right, so here's my cartoon, and then I was able to find a scanning EM, which is actually a beautiful one. Which kind of matches up nicely with the way I drew this thing. So all of these tube-like things are glomerular capillary. You can see how convoluted they are. And then surrounding them, okay, are these things called podocytes. And you can see these like tentacles with littler tentacles and then interdigitating tentacles even further down. All right. What these podocytes do is they basically form things called filtration slits, or the slit barrier, the glomerular filtration barrier. And these barriers determine what will be and what won't be filtered. So they're very important. So podocytes are cells that, for our purposes, essentially surround the glomerulus and create a barrier, a selective barrier for what will be filtered. Now you do have this EM, all right, so you can take a closer look at it. Just to point this out so when you look at it, and I don't want to belabor this, this big glob right here, this is a body of a podocyte, and this guy here is sending out its little tentacles like it's like a big sea monster all over the place. And then there's another cell body over here, and there's kind of another one over here. You can see how elaborate this thing is. So selectivity of what will and won't be filtered, very, very important. Why is this important? Because we know, we just looked at our urinalysis very quickly, that there are some things that we see in urine from a healthy person and some things we shouldn't see. Okay? We know in a healthy person you should never see glucose unless it's a pregnant woman. That's okay. Talk about that. Oh no, that's not the medical stuff. I don't do pregnancy in this story. Okay? We know in a healthy person we should see a little bit of sodium in urine. We should see a lot of water. We shouldn't see any blood cells. We shouldn't see any measurable amount of protein. Okay? Well, a lot of that's due to what these creatures are enabling. All right, more about that later. All right, so let's build on this and talk a little bit about this process called clearance and glomerular filtration rate. And I have that spelled out, and we're going to talk about GFR from now on every day, zillions of times a day. Glomerular filtration rate. Okay? It's what the glomerulus is doing. Clearance, what that means, and this is written out in the e-book, but just to give you a brief definition, that means how much of something can the kidneys remove from blood per unit time. Okay, so if something is cleared, that means that it's taken out of blood and it ends up in excreted urine. It's not put back into blood. All right? So we talk about clearance of things like glucose and sodium and everything. All right? So with that in mind, let's talk about some things that occur, mechanisms, versus clearance in GFR. Okay? So glomerular filtration rate, before I get too far ahead of myself, glomerular filtration rate is simply how much the glomerulus filters something per unit time. Okay? And we have some things, again, that I just mentioned that the glomerulus should filter and some things that they shouldn't filter. Therefore, the clearances will march along with that concept. Let's look at something that's not filtered. For example, most proteins. Let's just say proteins. We'll qualify that later. All right? Well, that means since these things are not filtered, the clearance of proteins by the kidney equals 0. Right? They're not leaving the bloodstream at the level of the kidneys. Okay? Let's jump down to glucose, and then we'll talk about one or two more of these. Let's talk about something that's filtered by the glomerulus, but it's completely reabsorbed by the time it works its way through the nephron, and therefore doesn't end up in excreted urine. Okay? Well, that means that the clearance of glucose is also 0, but for a different reason. In the case of the proteins, it's not filtered. In the case of glucose, it's freely filtered, but it all gets reabsorbed, so the clearance is still 0. Let's talk about this thing here because it's a prep question favorite. You'll never get anything about this from me because we don't use it anymore, but inulin, and that's not a typo, that's what it's called, inulin. It so happens that this compound is filtered by the glomerulus, but it's neither reabsorbed nor secreted. So in other words, once this thing called inulin gets filtered, nothing else happens to it, and it's all excreted. Therefore, the clearance of inulin equals GFR. And years and years and years ago, when I was coming up, they kind of stopped using this stuff. But we used to actually use this to measure kidney function. It's expensive and invasive. And so now we use something called creatinine. So let's talk about that, and then we'll come back to it in detail. Creatinine is filtered, and a tiny bit of it is secreted, but none of it is reabsorbed. So it's kind of similar to inulin, but we make creatinine inside of us. So we use it as a marker for clearance approximating GFR. Not exactly equal to, but sort of equal to GFR. Therefore, GFRs, and again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, when we measure this stuff, you'll always see a little e in front of GFR, always. And what that means is estimated. All right, and we'll qualify that in just a minute. So just hang in there. All right. So GFR, let's spend some time talking about this thing. Now that I talked about it, let me talk about it. Glomerular filtration rate. Well, you kind of get it, from the description. And it's measured in this unit of measurement. It's a rate, so it's a volume per minute, et cetera, et cetera. And we talk about this as being a fundamental marker of renal health because it's what we can easily estimate. And a lot of stuff that can go wrong with the kidneys, not everything, but a lot of stuff begins at the level of the glomerulus. The filtration barrier can get attacked by either autoimmune or disease states, okay, and there's all kinds of stuff that can go wrong. We're really not going to talk about much of that except in the context of diabetes, which also attacks the glomerulus. Hypertension attacks the glomerulus, okay, and can cause all kinds of problems. So it is a fundamental marker. We'll talk about what controls GFR later on. We've kind of already started to touch upon the ideas of some things that should be freely filtered. So what kind of things do you think are freely filtered by the glomerulus? In other words, they'll come from blood and get into forming urine. Whatever happens to them after that, we'll talk about. But we already mentioned a few of them. Yeah, every ion you can imagine, because they're teeny tiny, okay? And their charge isn't significant enough to affect the charge barrier that's part of the filtration barrier. What else? Water, of course, absolutely. Freely filtered. You notice this word freely filtered. No impediment to filtration. Anything else that comes to mind? I'll give you a hint, I mentioned it. Glucose, yeah, remember, it's freely filtered, but normally it all gets reabsorbed. Okay. Anything else anybody can think of? All right, forget that. What about some things that aren't freely filtered? In other words, in a healthy urine from a healthy person, what shouldn't show up? Yeah, things like measurable amounts, significant amounts of any protein, and albumin's really the only one we look at. Blood cells, period. She said white blood cells, but red blood cells too. That could be a glomerular problem or downstream. Anything else? Those are the two biggies, right? Okay, great. So then we talk about the amount of things that are freely filtered. Well, how much of what's freely filtered should be freely filtered? This gets into the kind of nuances of being a nephrologist. Okay, and that's called the filtered load. So we can calculate a filtered load of sodium, and then kind of do some back calculations and figure out based on, what's in excreted urine and what's in plasma. Well, does it look like the glomeruli are doing what they should be doing? Okay, that's a quick explanation, but it gets you where you need to be. And we talked about the idea of some things that shouldn't be freely filtered. Oh yeah, and then the idea of what's freely filtered, how much of that actually ends up showing up in excreted urine. So that's simply the fractional excretion. So it's basically a derivation of the filtered load. I think I have an equation for this later to give you a fractional excretion. So you kind of build this story from the glomerulus to the urinalysis sample. You can find out and determine a lot of things. And we'll talk about how GFR is determined. I think we might go there next. And then the clinics, very importantly, the clinical significance of changes in GFR. To give you kind of the crescendo of this story, all right? What we worry about and what shows disease state in terms of kidney disease is when GFR starts to go down. And that's what happens in sick people with sick kidneys. Now, don't worry about getting that now. We're going to talk about that in detail. But we have stages of kidney disease that are based upon GFR. Yes, sir?
So is GFR, is that per molecule? Like is each molecule have its own GFR?
No, GFR is the rate of glomerular filtration.
Right.
Yeah, for how much of everything the glomerulus is filtering per unit time, per minute. Okay? Anything else at this point? All right. Well, here we go. So let's start to look at some data. All right, these are easy data. All right, what does this figure tell you? Okay, first of all, let me help you. Age in years, that's easy. And then this is simply GFR with the appropriate units of measurement. What do these data tell you? Somebody tell me one thing. Yes, sir?
There's differences between men and women.
Okay, so there's gender differences. Yes?
GFR decline in how old you get.
Yeah, and there's a normal, a physiologic decline with age, like everything else. We hate that. All right. Notice that the bottom end, and we take it out to like 90 years old approximately, right? Ends up being about 60, a GFR of about 60. All right, that number's going to come back again. You're going to see that the lab kind of reports that as anything above that's okay, and anything below we get worried about, but we'll come back to that. And as was said, there's a normal gender-based difference. Usually, when we look at big populations of people, remember that's how this stuff is done. Women's GFR is a little bit less than men's. Part of the reason of that is because the reason we estimate GFR is using this thing called creatinine, which comes from muscle, which I think I show on the next slide. And usually women have less muscle mass than men. So that really is kind of the Cliff Notes version of why you're seeing these differences. But the two differences are important to note. One thing you should note are the extremes. So a very old person versus a younger person, GFRs in a healthy young person should be 100, 120-ish. Okay? My age, somewhere in here. Okay? Okay, it's right here. I'm actually on the figure, all right? Like I can get away with like 85 or 90. All right? And they're not going to say that's a problem, even though they want to, because everyone wants to make a problem out of everything. Okay? All right, and then this, you don't need to remember much about this. I just put this up here as an example of how clinically this is looked at. So these are GFRs, 100 going down to 10. Okay? And then stages of kidney disease and kidney damage. So in other words, if a person has some things showing up in urine that shouldn't be there, and there's a GFR of 100, that's still showing that there's a problem. And don't get confused by that again. You can just sit and listen to this. Then you can see that with a decrease in kidney function, mild to moderate, moderate to severe, and then severe, well, look how low these GFRs get based on that previous figure. And then we define a GFR of less than 15, which is a number you should just remember, as kidney failure. If you see a GFR in the teens, that's a problem, okay? And then what we have to do is these people need to be put on renal replacement, dialysis, maybe pending a kidney transplant if that's what they want to do. It's up to the patient. All right? So that's the idea. But please understand this extreme and rank it against the previous bar chart that we looked at. Okay. All right, let's talk about how we estimate GFR. Let's get down to it. This is important. We use something called creatinine. Who's heard of creatinine? Right. Yeah, it's that crap you buy from the health food store for $1 million at a jug that's supposed to give you quick, powerful muscular strength, which does work, by the way, for some people, sometimes. So you have a lot of asterisks after that. All right. Well, what creatinine is, just as a brief background, is a derivation of the creatine phosphate reaction, okay, which is a natural part of muscle metabolism. And creatine is produced, and then that's metabolized to produce creatinine. Now, in us, if you're healthy, you will have a remarkably steady state level of creatinine circulating in your plasma. So a little bit of this stuff gets out of muscle, it's metabolized, it floats around, and that really won't change very much at all unless something happens to you or you do something to yourself by way of diet, and we'll talk about some of that and other things. Notice that there's a range of what we call a normal creatinine, and the importance of this is more reading it as less than 1.5. Don't worry about the 0.5 as much. Okay, and we'll show examples of when 1.5 might not be appropriate, but less than 1.5, we don't want to see creatinines greater than 1.5, okay, because that may possibly indicate a problem with kidney function. But again, there's a lot of variables we have to consider. Okay, anyways, getting back to our creatinine story, creatinine then gets into the renal circulation, and as I mentioned before, it's freely filtered. Okay, no impediment to being filtered. It's not reabsorbed. That's the really important second point. And then the asterisk is that there's a tiny bit of secretion that occurs downstream in the nephron, so that makes this an imperfect test, but it's a good estimate in an otherwise healthy person. Okay? So that makes this thing we call creatinine something that we use to estimate GFR. So quite simply, what's done in today's world, and I have a lot of this in the ebook, probably even have a link to a calculator just so you can see it, is you'll plug and chug some numbers. You're going to get a plasma creatinine in your patient, okay? And you're going to take probably their age and whether or not they're black or white, basically, is the only ethnic difference we worry about for this measurement. And then maybe BMI, and then maybe BUN. You know, they might ask for some other information, and then that'll spit out an estimated GFR. Okay? Old school physiology course, I make you do this stuff by hand, and you'll all get it wrong because the units of measure are horrible. All right? But you don't need to worry about that. You just need to understand what it means and what a normal value should look like. All right, let's talk about some things that will affect creatinine levels. Okay, well, there are racial variations between, for example, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. You know, increase, decrease, decrease, respectively. And again, generally this has something, again, these are done in big population studies, has to do with relative muscle mass, mostly. Okay. Kidney disease, well, the thing is that what will happen is that creatinine levels go up when the kidneys fail. Remember, creatinine is freely filtered. So if now the glomerulus isn't filtering so good, not as much creatinine is being removed from blood, is being cleared, so plasma creatinine goes up. So there's going to be this inverse relationship between GFR and creatinine. We'll get into that more later. And it's kind of builds on what I said before, low muscle mass versus large muscle mass in anybody, relative to an age, gender matched control. If you have a lot of skeletal muscle, your creatinine levels will be a little bit higher. If you eat, let's jump down here, a lot of cooked red meat. Now, cooked isn't meant to sound silly. It's like when you cook red meat, you release a lot of creatinine from that muscle, and that gets into your bloodstream, and your creatinine levels can go up transiently. Whereas a vegetarian diet, okay, a vegetarian tends to have a little bit lower creatinines, all of the things you do. Okay. What else is important? Malnutrition, don't worry about that. Don't worry about these two various medications. That's like, well, everyone can affect it, so whatever. I just said look up the medications. All right, so the important things to realize are really the idea of muscle mass, kidney disease, and, oh, I want to mention obesity, right in the middle. That's why I didn't look at it. It's not body habitus. It's muscle mass versus less. Fat mass doesn't affect creatinine. So there's some creatinine calculators online that we use that take into account this thing called body mass index, okay, which is a loose index of fat in some people. Another a lot of asterisks after that thing, all right? So please keep that in mind. Okay. So memorize these equations and be able to use them. I just wanted to put this up here to show you that the math involved, like I don't even know how to do this anymore, like even with my calculator, you know. You plug and chug, that's all you do. And you won't even be asked to do that except maybe on a practice problem. I might say, hey, you might want to look this up just for fun. You're not going to do this for exam purposes. You should understand what creatinine, what GFR means, what values look good and don't, and we're going to practice that. Okay, shock value over. Let's look at an important figure which helps to really explain some important things about creatinine and GFR. So this is one of these double axis figures which can be real useful, and it is. Bottom axis is showing GFR. Okay? The inner y-axis is plasma creatinine. That's what this PCR means, not polymerase chain reaction. And BUN is the outer axis, blood urea nitrogen. Now we're just going to focus on creatinine mainly. So what I've done in green is I've blocked out a normal value of creatinine. So see, here's like 1.5 right here and less. And look where this value overlays with GFRs, ranging from greater than 120 all the way down to maybe 60-ish, maybe 70. Okay? So what we're calling a normal creatinine, okay, less than 1.5, actually covers a wide range of GFRs. Now, why is this important? I don't have a dedicated slide. I probably tried to explain this in the ebook. What I'm going to say now is very important to try and follow. What is a big red flag in the clinic is when creatinine goes up, when GFR goes down, right? That's a marker of something going on in the kidneys, either good, bad, maybe it doesn't mean anything. What means something is if there's a change over time that sets a pattern. For example, let's say we have a patient who's let's see, how are we going to do this? Whose creatinine is hovering around 0.5. And that obviously is going to fall in line with the GFR of perfectly normal, greater than 100. Okay? Now, 3 months, let's make this a diabetic patient because this is the kind of stuff we run into. A year later, this person's creatinine jumps up to 1. And you or I wouldn't look twice at that if you're not diabetic. But there's been a 50%, 100% increase, okay, in the amount of creatinine, which correlates to a fairly significant decrease in GFR. So GFR has actually dropped quite a bit, but based just on the creatinine, it looks like it's perfectly normal. So if you just look at that single measurement in that person, you'd say, oh, there's no problem here. But compared to a year ago, things have fallen. Okay, GFR has gone down quite significantly. Right? Now this person comes back, we're like, you better come back in like 6 months and want to get this. And their creatinine is now 1.4. Okay? It was a year and a half ago, it was 0.5. That's a threefold increase in creatinine, which is correlating to a tremendous drop in GFR. All right, now this person has a kidney failure, they're nowhere near it, but you can see this relationship is going down quite significantly, and if that trend continues, that's going to lead to problems. It's what we call diabetic kidney disease. Okay? So it's a history. It's a history of measurements that you need because a single measurement can be very, very deceiving. Okay? If a young woman comes in who is slightly built, okay, and her creatinine is 1.5, that to me is too high. Okay, even though it technically is within the reference standard. Normally her creatinine would probably be in the 0 point something. On the other hand, if one of the bigger guys in the room comes in who has a fair amount of muscle mass and his creatinine is 1.5 or even 1.6, that probably doesn't mean anything. That's just a derivation of muscle mass. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. But then if those creatinines start to change, that is, could indicate a problem. All right. So please try and understand that. We'll be, again, looking at examples of that as we move on. All right, now I'm just going to quickly put on BUN because BUN is outlined in the yellow box. The normal values range between about 10 and 20 milligrams per deciliter. And again, it falls kind of, that's falling within what we call a normal range of GFR. What BUN, though, is mostly a marker of hydration status. In other words, what happens is that as we become really dehydrated, sometimes GFRs will drop down a little bit, and then BUN will go up. Okay? And it's usually, in and of itself, not an intrarenal problem. That's usually indicating like a kidney perfusion problem, maybe due to just dehydration or maybe heart failure. I mean, it could be a number of reasons. The point I want to make now with the figure with both colors on it is that GFR is the kidney thing. Okay? Creatinine is the kidney thing. BUN is not the intrarenal thing. That's usually an extrarenal thing that's affecting the kidneys. Blood flow, blood pressure, something like that. Okay, so GFR, the most fundamental clinical determinant of renal function. I can't say it any more direct than that. And as we said, because of using creatinine, current measurements are given as estimates. And there are a lot of assumptions that have to be met for it to be used as an indicator of it being creatinine. Steady state production of creatinine is one important factor. Okay, let's stop there and talk about a person with a normal creatinine who gets very, very ill. And let's say their cortisol levels go up. And that starts to chew up muscle to provide for increases in blood glucose. And their creatinine levels go up. Okay? Well, that's not steady state production or a steady state creatinine, that's due to something else happening. If a person undergoes or has a horrendous crushing injury, and they're taken to the hospital auto accident or something, their legs get all mashed up. Ugly picture, but you get the idea. Their creatinine levels are going to be through the roof. Why? Because that damaged muscle has dumped out all its creatinine, and like we're not worried about kidney function in that person, right? That's the idea. So steady state production is an important factor. And a so-called, and this is what I was spending several minutes on, a so-called normal plasma creatinine actually represents that broad range of GFR. So the change is what can clue us that there's a problem. Single measurements can be deceiving or misleading, whichever word you like better. Good? Think about it. All right, we're not going to spend any time on this. The words are more important than the equation. The equation just shows you stuff that may do more damage than good. Filtered load, the amount of some substance X that's filtered by the glomerulus per unit time. And then, of course, there's an equation for that. Yeah, I think you really need to know it. I put it up there in case you're curious. So the plasma concentration of X simply times GFR. The fractional excretion, however, is the ratio of the amount of that which was filtered to its filtered, excreted to that which was filtered. Okay? So the important take-home point is excretion is the end product, the filtered load is the glomerular process that's occurring. You can make comparisons mathematically. You won't have to do that, but you can do that, and that can give you a whole lot of information. Yes, sir. That's a really great question, and the answer is probably not. I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're going to talk about diabetes, but the idea is when diabetes starts to have end organ effects at the level of the kidney, that's generally not something that's reversible, but it can usually be, it sometimes can be slowed or stopped. So that's the idea, is like, okay, well, we see somewhat of a decrease in kidney function, and that's concerning. Let's at the very least try and slow that down. And if that's in a type 2 diabetic, for example, who's 70 years old, the prognosis is pretty good. If it's in a really young person, well, we got to be pretty aggressive and try and keep that from exacerbating itself too quickly. That's the idea. And we're going to talk about more of that in either the third or fourth session. It's a really important thing. You go over to the nephrology clinic, and who do you see there? You see the odd-out cancer patient, and that's always tragic. And of the other 15 people that are sitting in there on dialysis, one is maybe a cancer patient, and the other 14 either have hypertension that's been uncontrolled or they're diabetics. I mean, the numbers are staggering. That's not an unrealistic example. Okay. Let's do a case because we need to just breathe. Here we have an 89-year-old man who's brought in by his daughter. He has sudden onset delirium. His vitals are unremarkable. Okay. What that means? It means move on. All right. Initial blood chemistry reveals moderate dehydration. PET CT reveals no abnormalities. He's admitted. Condition deteriorates. Several days later, we have some blood labs that we take a look at, and here you have a whole bunch of stuff. Now, in and amongst this very daunting, scary-looking thing is a very specific question. What is the status of this patient's renal function? Okay, so lesson learned from this is that when we talk about renal function, we're talking about looking here, 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 and here. Okay, so now looking at those, based on what we've talked about this morning or this afternoon, I don't want to do today over. I had to go pick up my car from Bell Howdy for $1,400 for new tires on that thing. I'm going to go back and buy a Hyundai, I think. What's the status of this guy's renal function? Any ideas based on his age? What he's a man? I'm sorry? Going down? Okay, so what's your criteria for saying that for those of us who aren't following you? Yeah.
His GFR is low for his age.
Yeah, his GFR is low even for a pretty old guy, for an 89-year-old. That may be concerning. Okay. BUN to creatinine ratio, don't worry about that, but I'm here to tell you that usually shouldn't be any higher than about 20. Okay. What about his creatinine? Does that make sense based on his GFR? This is a good lesson learned from his mini kids. Inverse relationship. In you or I, if GFR goes down, your creatinine will go up. If GFR goes up, your creatinine will go down, assuming what? Steady state production of creatinine. Please drill that in. That's the fundamental thing. Okay? And its BUN is actually really, really high. Normally it shouldn't be any higher than 20. Well, this guy's probably still dehydrated and has maybe a slowing down of renal function. Okay? Then all this other stuff will start to build this story later on. Okay, and I basically was just showing that in this guy, the only things that are normal are not highlighted. So, there was a lot going on, but this actually leads into a much more elaborate case that we could look at later on. Okay, so renal function was a specific question, and I'm glad that you keyed up on at least these two things you should begin to recognize. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. The ratio, don't really worry too much about that. Starling's forces. Okay, unfortunately, I didn't spend really any time on this in cardio, although it was in my ebook. We need to talk about it briefly right now. I just want to mention that we talk about Starling's forces of the microcirculation. It's the same guy that figured out the Starling curves, the inotropic curves. All right. We have two forces, hydraulic or hydrostatic and oncotic. What these mean are water pressure, and they call it protein pressure, but it's actually the osmotic pressure of proteins. Proteins, like albumin, are heavily charged. So what does that mean? They love to grab onto water. Okay? Therefore, albumin helps keep water in the intravascular volume. All right, that's a little background. So we talk about the glomerular capillary. Blood's coming in from the afferent arteriole. It's traversing through the capillary. So here's a small little piece of the glomerular capillary. And there's a huge, so the size of the arrow means the relative amount of the force. A huge hydrostatic or hydraulic pressure that pushes fluid out of this capillary. So that's what's causing or resulting in GFR. Okay? Then there's a little bit of an oncotic pressure that exists inside of Bowman's capsule, because there is a tiny bit of albumin that's in there, but it all gets reabsorbed after Bowman's capsule. Okay? So these two forces are basically pushing and pulling fluid out of the capillary. So that's all filtration. Then we compare it to these two tiny arrows where there's a tiny hydrostatic force in Bowman's capsule and a much lower oncotic force within the glomerular capillary relative to these two. Okay, so that's why what do glomeruli do? They filter stuff. Okay, so these four forces, these four properties, you should really remember. And I'm sorry I didn't get into it better in cardio. The same thing applies to microcirculation in your arm or your gut or your legs. Okay? Same forces are in operation. Same general idea. Alrighty then. Yeah. An equation. I just put it on there to show you can calculate this stuff. You will never do it. You'll never see that from me again. Get into like these boards review things, and then I'm here to tell you if that time ever comes for you, ignore this stuff. Because the MBME isn't going to ask you to calculate that stuff. They'll ask you much more difficult things. All right. Let's talk about pressure changes, blood pressure changes as blood traverses this component of the microcirculation. So here we are. Blood is coming in from the renal artery with kind of a pressure change, or I'm sorry, a max pressure that's somewhat familiar. By the time blood gets into the renal artery, its pressure's gone down a little bit. That doesn't really matter. You can think of this as a mean arterial pressure. Then note what happens. Here's the afferent arteriole. Okay? There's a big pressure drop that occurs from the beginning to the inflow to the outflow of the afferent arteriole. Why does that occur? What do arterioles do for a living? You better remember that from cardio. They have a lot of vascular smooth muscle, so they can create a delta P, a big delta P. So that's what actually happens here. Then we notice that, so you see pressure does drop down. So then by the time blood gets into the glomerular capillary, blood pressure has dropped quite a bit. You know, remember, just like in systemic circulation, capillary blood pressure is really low compared to arterial. I mean, really low, because capillaries, they want to filter stuff and reabsorb a few things. And if you bombard them with huge pressures, what happens? They blow apart. Okay, so they have to be kind of protected. Then, as blood leaves the glomerular capillary into the efferent arteriole, you see there's another delta P. Same idea. These guys still are packed with vascular smooth muscle, so we creates what we call a pressure head from one side to the other. And then finally, at the level of the renal vein, we see that pressures then drop down to, what we talked about in terms of venous type pressures, which are much lower than the arterial side. Okay. So we still have that pressure gradient that's favoring flow through this network, just like systemically. Okay. All right, let's look at how pressures in the glomerulus can be affected by changes in tone in the afferent or efferent arterioles. So here we have our resting complex, afferent, glomerulus, efferent, okay? Some basal tone. And let's say this guy's existing, this glomerulus, at around 40 millimeters of mercury, 40 to 50, it doesn't matter, you get the idea. What if the afferent arteriole is selectively constricted? Okay, this is kind of an artificial situation, but it could happen, and we'll qualify that later. Well, why does glomerular pressure drop? It's the same properties we talked about in the heart, in the cardiovascular, yeah. Huh? Right, remember? If you clamp down on the inflow hose, pressure downstream has to decrease. So what's going to happen is GFR is going to decrease then, okay, because glomerular pressure, that hydrostatic pressure is going to dictate in part the rate of filtration. So if you lower pressure, GFR is going to go down. And this right here, RPF, you can also call this RDF, renal plasma or renal blood flow, is also decreased. Simply because you're clamping up here, everything downstream is going to be lower. Okay, so that shouldn't be too revolutionary. If we look at the bottom cartoon, well, now we're doing just the opposite. This is much more of a physiologic situation that we'll qualify later. Normal inflow, okay, but now there's selective constriction of the efferent arteriole. Why does pressure go up in our little glomerulus? A balloon with a hose feeding it and a hose emptying it. You clamp on the hose emptying it. What happens to pressure in the balloon? With no change in flow, pressure in the balloon is going to go up. Well, that's what's happening here. Then consequentially, or likewise, GFR will increase in this model. And we'll talk about where this is important. Don't worry. All right? Downstream blood flow, okay, from the efferent arteriole is also going to be reduced. Okay? So please keep that in mind, and we're going to bring this all together. And then finally, we're going to get real dramatic, and we're going to concomitantly or jointly constrict both. Afferent and efferent, okay? Some new homeostasis is going to be reached where actually glomerular pressure may mimic something close to what it was when it was resting, okay? But at the end of the day, renal blood flow is going to be very, very severely impaired, okay? This example is something that would only happen with extremes in activation of like the sympathetic nervous system, where someone is in real dire straits. And the idea of this is just starting to knock down GFR pretty severely and really shunting blood away from the kidneys to elsewhere. Right? We're going to learn later that the payment for that can be renal ischemia. The kidneys can get damaged and never recover from that. We wouldn't want this to really happen, but it can. We're going to look at that again later. Keep saying that body. So the question posed then is, what's the advantage of decreasing renal blood flow in terms of maintaining body fluid homeostasis? So I'm going to tell you something right now that's going to make no sense at all. It's the most fun part of my job, but then we make sense of it. This is the physiologic situation when blood pressure goes down. Okay? Through the actions of angiotensin 2, and we'll get into all that in detail like 3 or 4 different times, there will be basically selective constriction of the efferent arteriole. Okay? What that does at the very least is if GFR had dropped, it brings GFR back up. And what it does is makes very optimal conditions for reabsorption. Let's see how that works. You'd think that, well, if my blood pressure goes down, why don't I just clamp down on the kidney and lower GFR? Well, then reabsorption gets screwed up. I mean, the kidney is really balanced, and the kidney likes to operate where GFR kind of remains constant. It doesn't like drama. Okay? Why is that? I don't know. Oh, I'll tell you. so let's start to build this story a little bit so it makes sense. So to a degree, glomerular filtration is actually coupled to reabsorption. And that's what we're going to look at now. So here's the scenario. Afferent blood. Remember, this is coming from the systemic circulation. It's got lots of water, it's got lots of albumin, and it's got a lot of volume. Okay? Gets into the glomerulus, and filtration occurs. But what's filtered? A lot of water, some other stuff, but little, if any, albumin is filtered. Okay, now we're starting to think of Starling's forces. Okay. So when blood leaves the glomerulus, remember there's millions of these all doing this at the same time. When blood leaves the glomerulus, okay, there's much less water, but there's lots of albumin left behind, so it has a huge oncotic pressure, it being the intravascular volume. And because it has lost so much water, it has a much lower hydrostatic pressure compared to what's going on out here. So now we zoom in on the paratubular capillary, and here's the interstitium that's resting outside of this thing. Okay, and here's the paratubular capillary, which is kind of running along the vasa recta. Okay. There's a very large interstitial fluid pressure, hydrostatic pressure, that wants to push fluid into that capillary because that water is being reabsorbed from the forming urine, okay, into the interstitium, and it's exerting pressure, so it wants to be reabsorbed. It wants to move back into the capillary. And then we have this huge oncotic pressure inside the paratubular capillaries that's sucking water back in. So it's a dual force that's favoring reabsorption. And you got to remember, with water, sodium's coming along, potassium, other stuff, oh my, chloride, all the things that we need to maintain normal systemic intravascular volume and try and get blood pressure back up, or at least keep it from dropping any lower. So by maintaining filtration, conditions are set up that are optimal for reabsorption, right up front. Okay? And as twisted as that sounds, it's the way the kidney's designed. It does a pretty good job of it. That's why if GFR drops down really, 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 really low, these reabsorptive gradients get all screwed up, and reabsorption is not favored, and the kidney just says, you know, I'm done. Okay? So graphically, I did this very generically on purpose. So the x-axis, we're simply showing a condition between relative basal GFR, GFR in the face of low blood pressure acutely, and then when renin, angiotensin, etc. gets activated. So what happens is that as a result of something, blood pressure is plummeted. Then we have selective constriction of the efferent arteriole, which raises GFR back to this optimal range, which is our optimal reabsorptive range. Okay? So again, very generically, this is the idea of getting GFR, what was here, back up to here, so these reabsorptive gradients are restored and everything just moves very, very efficiently. What we've been talking about is intrarenal, inside the kidney, regulation of glomerular function. Okay? There's another mechanism that comes into play, which is more of a housekeeper under normal circumstances, and this is a doozy, the tubular glomerular feedback mechanism. So we call it the TGF mechanism. All right? We all do, because we just hate saying this word and writing it out. This mechanism uses sodium in forming urine to tell the kidney, tell the glomerulus to either slow down or speed up GFR. Let's see how that works. This may be a little bit confusing, so let's just look at this graph right here. Okay, this representation, it's showing the same thing. So with increased GFR, there's going to be increased tubular flow. What I mean by that is that the forming urine that's flowing through the tubules, is the amount of it is increased per unit time. Well, you got to remember, in that forming urine is a lot of sodium chloride. Okay? As that sodium chloride traverses, and the loop of Henle would be like down here on the stage, and then it comes back up to the thick ascending limb, that sodium chloride gets back up here, and there's a region that kind of communicates between the thick ascending limb and the glomerulus. Okay, so when we look at the nephron, you know, we look at this very two-dimensional, like here's Bowman's capsule and here's the tubules. Well, really, the distal nephron is like up here, and so the distal nephron is talking to the proximal nephron and able to communicate. And one of the things that's used to communicate is like this thing called the macula densa is a group of cells that's kind of tucked in between, okay, and they have like sodium chloride sensors. And if a lot of sodium chloride comes gushing by the macula densa, it tells the macula densa that GFR is too high. Okay? So what the macula densa does then, shift down here, is it secretes vasoconstrictors, which are, now I'm going to point up here, which are selective against the afferent arteriolar smooth muscle. Different receptors, different vasoconstrictors, not angiotensin 2. All right? So with constriction of the afferent arteriole, you can go back and look at that model. Okay? Blood inflow flow into the glomerulus is going to be reduced, glomerular pressure is going to drop down, and GFR is going to drop down. Then as soon as as a result of that drop in GFR, then sodium chloride delivery to the macula densa is going to slow down. It's going to say, okay, we're cool, and it's going to stop secreting these selective vasoconstrictors. Everything will resort back to where it was. Okay, this mechanism is not meant to combat fluid volume loss, severe pathology, hemorrhage, anything. This is a housekeeper. It's from moment to moment. This TGF thing is kind of monitoring GFR, you know, like you're turning up and down your radio when you're driving. I make my wife crazy, you know. All right, and it's a modulator. All right? Extremes will blow this thing out. It gets desensitized very, very quickly. Okay? So it's an important thing to just kind of acknowledge. I spent as much time talking about it as you should spend studying it, a few minutes, and just kind of acknowledge its existence and the basic idea of why we have this thing. Okay? TGF mechanism. All right, let's start to integrate some things in for the last few minutes, and this will be a good place to pick it up on Thursday, Monday. Yeah, right. Integration of renal and cardiovascular function. This is one of our favorite cartoons, our little heart and our kidney dancing a happy dance. This is normally what we want, okay? We're going to now spend so much time revisiting and extending what we know about the RAAS. We're going to go back and revisit AVP, and now we're going to bring in atrial natriuretic peptide. I mentioned it in passing during the cardio section, but we'll spend a little more time on it later on. Why do we have a renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system? What do we remember from cardio? Why? What's the simple answer to that question? Again, you have to explain it to a 15-year-old. Let's get out of the 6-year-olds. It's hard to explain anything. It helps with hypotension. Right. It's a mechanism that its most fundamental mechanism is to raise blood pressure. Right? That's why we have it. That's a great answer. So now we're going to come back and talk about some more details about it. Maintain perfusion pressure. Okay? Maintain blood pressure. Remember, we talked about this. We can live with hypertension. We can't live with hypotension. At least not too long. Okay, so local control of afferent tone. What I'm pointing out in this figure is that when we talk about control of vasoconstriction at either the efferent or the afferent, the glomerular vascular endothelium becomes very, very important because vascular endothelium is a very metabolically active tissue, and this endothelium can secrete vasoconstrictors and vasodilators. Right? There are vasoconstrictor prostaglandins that are secreted, which have specific receptors in the efferent arteriole, which can cause vasoconstriction. And then, of course, the efferent arteriolar vascular smooth muscle is packed full of AT1 receptors. Remember, those are the angiotensin vasoconstrictor receptors. Okay. On the other hand, this endothelium can also secrete a different type of prostaglandin, specifically E2, you don't need to know that, and nitric oxide, which are vasodilators, and the receptor and signaling for those only exist in the afferent arteriolar smooth muscle. So we have this ability at the level of the glomerulus to actually control glomerular function. So there's all these levels, these tiers of control for glomerular pressure and GFR, quadruple redundancy and beyond. Very, very important. In addition to the effects of angiotensin 2, which we're coming back to. All right? Biosynthetic pathway, just so we walk through this, we're going to march through this quickly. I'm not a big biosynthetic pathway guy, but this one becomes important for a couple of reasons. The idea of precursors leading to the production of A2. All right, we talked about the receptor AT1 last time. There's an AT2 receptor, which we'll talk about in more detail probably in the next session. I want to remind you of the importance of renin, like renal, which is secreted by JG cells, which allows for this pathway to be mobilized. Okay? I will remind you of the importance of ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, as an important regulatory step in the production of angiotensin 2. Remember, we talked about these two important enzymes in the context antibiotics, the medicines that are used to knock these things out to control our friend hypertension, or our enemy, I should say. And this is to help remind you of these points of medical intervention. Renin inhibitors, aldosterone is the only one we talked about, a whole host of ACE inhibitors, okay, the PRLs, they all end in that, and the receptor blockers, the type 1 receptor blockers, the sartans, S-A-R-T-A-N-S, they all end in that. Yeah, I just want to quickly point out, maybe we'll end here, maybe one more slide. There is an alternative pathway. There's another type of ACE, okay, which can actually take angiotensin 2 and convert it to angiotensin 7. And this has gotten really hot now in research and in medicine, because this thing, basically through the MOS receptor, which is not like MOS tequila, it stands for something else, does kind of the opposite of angiotensin 2. It's like vasodilatory, and we're kind of hoping that that has an effect in humans, but we really don't know. So acknowledge its existence, and no details about that, but this other pathway that, you know, more to follow. The intrarenal renin-angiotensin system, the purpose of this slide is to point out the fact that the basic model is that SNS postganglionics innervate JG cells. And remember, the neurotransmitter that's secreted by postganglionics is almost always norepinephrine, not epinephrine. Okay? Norepi then will cause the secretion of renin, which within the kidney, this is simply showing the peritubular epithelial cells, the kidney is completely equipped with an entire renin-angiotensin system to make all the angiotensin it needs and more. Okay? You will read in every textbook that, oh, you need the ACE that's expressed in the lungs and in the liver. You know, we don't need that. It's there, but a person doesn't need it to make the amount of angiotensin that we need to control blood pressure. All right? So the kidneys can do it all. This arrow right here is an important concept that you're going to hear a lot more about beginning today and onward, and that's negative feedback. Any hormone, okay, I don't care what it is, has a negative feedback mechanism to try and shut itself off, okay? And that's exactly what can happen here, is that when angiotensin levels get to a certain threshold, they will target the JG cells and cause the JG cells to stop secreting renin. All right? So please keep that in mind. We'll get into endocrinology. That's all we're going to be talking about is negative feedback. Thyroid hormone, cortisol, estrogen, testosterone, they all work the same way. All right, on that note, we're going to pick it up here on Monday. Have a nice weekend. I'll be in my office if anyone wants to talk about anything, either from this block or the previous block. So. Okay, now he told me to do something.